Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. It's super exciting. I'm particularly excited because so many great topics have emerged around in this conference. Conversation design, critical user journeys, collaboration and partnerships. And I'm super excited to be able to give you my perspective as a UX writer and looking through that lens and how it's different in certain ways in terms of our priorities and what we think about when we look at the language of our products. But first, I wanted to get a sense of, are there any UX writers in the room today? I don't think I see any at all. This is why this talk is particularly important, because I'm just really excited to define for you what UX writing is. But first, I want to start off with this quote. Words are free, but it's how you use them that may cost you. So what I love about this quote is that it really reminds us and warns us of the power of language. With UX writing, you can win your users over. That is true. But done poorly, it is just as easy to lose your users. So how can you keep your users coming back and engaged? That is the heart of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to take a step back and define, for you non-writers out there, what UX writing is. So you can flip through many a Medium article, and you'll find that someone will define UX writing as all of the words in the UI. It's those tooltips, the error messages, menu labels, call to action labels. It's the microcopy on a form field. And that is true. But all of the above are just tactical components of the craft. So having been a student of UX writing for the past decade or so, I like to think of it as the intersection of three buckets: words, empathy, and strategy. So what do I mean by words? I'm talking about craft expertise and being able to flex language so that it glues an entire experience together. So much so that the user doesn't even think about the words, doesn't even probably read them, and that they're just able to complete their tasks with ease. And then when I talk about empathy, I always love to think about language as being able to unearth the humanness of your product. So we build products for people, but oftentimes we forget about really these human connections that we can help make more meaningful through language. And I'm talking about anticipating and solving for pain points and trying to find delightful ways to do this. And then finally, strategy. When it comes to UX writing, it's really about staying focused on benchmarks of success, and that could be metrics. But at the same token, it's also really thinking about forming these really critical cross-functional partnerships, because you could have all of the recommendations on language, but if you don't have kind of business needs like really at the fore of what you're doing, then you're at a loss because you won't be able to incorporate those recommendations. At Google I/O in 2016, UX writing as a discipline had a really great shiny moment. So a few of my colleagues took the stage to define these UX writing guiding principles. That is, users first, be clear, concise, useful, and on brand. I say that this was a really great moment for us because before UX writers, engineers wrote all of the copy and all of the text. And you might find some discrepancies in some of these error messages or just the way that you speak to a user when 500 different people are writing for an experience on one screen. So being able to take the stage at I/O was a defining moment, because then we got to spread and promote UX writing as a discipline. And so when we're talking about users first, we're talking about focusing on your users, really trying to get that deeper understanding of what it is that they're motivated to do with your product. And when we talk about clarity, we're talking about not using jargon, using plain language so that it's universally understood. When we're concise, we're talking about the crisp language that makes all UX writing efficient and scannable, and oftentimes knowing that users don't read, so really making it easy for them to complete their tasks. Being useful, meaning making sure that every single piece of text moves the user forward through the entire experience, so again, they can complete their task. And then finally, being on brand. That means really finding out what it is about your product personality that you can kind of unearth with that authentic voice and staying true to that authentic voice. But going back to winning or losing users, the single most important thing is to get that deep understanding of users. Without this deep understanding, there's no amount of technique or craft expertise that can keep users engaged. So how are we going to do this? We'll take a look at some Google case studies using products across the ecosystem, but we'll try to kind of balance qualitative and quantitative research. And then we'll look at how to develop best practices across your org so that you can maintain a high quality, consistent experience at scale. All right, so the first example is Google Duo. So what is Google Duo? It is the cross-platform video calling app for Google. And so this example is going to point to using data to inform word choice. So this is going back to the strategy piece of UX writing. So post-launch, we didn't really know much about our users. So we thought, why not use this opportunity to experiment on invite text? What is invite text? So when you go to the actual app itself, there's an opportunity for you to share the app with your friend and ask them to join Google. So we wanted to kind of experiment on variations of that little piece of text. This text would then surface into your messaging client on your phone, and then you could share this piece of text with your friend to try to convince them to jump onto the Google Duo bandwagon. So we went ahead and tested several variations. So let's go through a few of them. A is, I tried calling you on Duo, but you're not on it yet. So this was kind of an appeal to FOMO, like everybody's at this party, but you're not there, trying to get people jealous of the fact. B is, get Duo so we can video chat on Android and iOS. C, I just heard about Google Duo for video chatting. Let's try it. And so this one is like an appeal to recency, and really, again, kind of appealing to that FOMO angle as well. D is a little bit crisper and concrete. Let's video chat on Duo. And then E is add me on Duo so that we can video chat. So just at a quick glance, I wanted to ask, does anybody have an opinion on which of these variations might have performed the best? Any guesses? D. E. Okay. All right, so on the right-hand side, this is the percentage of Duo installs based on as compared to the control. And so why did E outperform all of the other versions? Add me on Duo so that we can video chat. So add me leverages social speak, which kind of talks about the social graph in an offline space. And the focus is on the two friends, connecting them to achieve the same end goal. This invite is from one friend to another, and then you can see that Duo as the product kind of recedes into the background. So in B, the focus is pretty much product focused, right? Because you're like, get Duo, and that's front loaded. So it becomes less about the user. And so you can see kind of just how the variations in language and the nuances in tone really impact and influence how people gravitate towards your product. So what are the takeaways here? Keep it conversational every single time. If there are opportunities for you to leverage offline speak in your online app or space, take advantage of those things. How do people talk about your product in everyday life? Try to think about those terms and make sure that you can put them as part of your everyday experience. Cut, then cut again. So making it crisp and concise and scannable, super important, so that you can just move your users along. And then finally, each word should drive the goal. Make sure that each word belongs there, and if it doesn't, then cut it out mercilessly. All right, so the next example is on Google+, and this is talking about voice and tone. So let's kind of remind ourselves about Google+. It did not take the social media world by storm. This is true. But, so oftentimes at Google, we're really blessed to be able to work across a range of products. Some products fail, some products succeed, right? But every single time you are confronted with opportunities to learn from these failures. And for this particular product, it really taught me how users could shape the voice and tone of a product rather than the other way around. Oftentimes, you work with a voice and tone spectrum and you're trying to define the personality of your product. And then you go through an entire experience in trying to kind of adhere to these certain critical points in the journey. But we did that, and we found that it didn't resonate with our users. So let me just give you an example. So when I first joined Google+, this was about a time where we were thinking about revamping the entire experience. And we were like, what does the new Google+ mean to us? So somebody came up with this tagline internally. It's an interest-based sharing network. And we're like, that is brilliant. Yes, that is a definition that is crisp, it's concise. So we're just like walking around the hallways in meeting rooms saying, the new Google+, an interest-based sharing network. So while we were all patting ourselves on the back for this tagline, around the same time we were doing field studies. And this trifecta of words comes up, people, content, and conversations, over and over again. And we wanted to dig into that. What ended up happening was, during these field studies, we talked about, we introduced the new Google+ as this interest-based sharing network. People were like, well, what does that even mean? But when they talked about their experiences on using Google+, again, these words kept surfacing over and over. And so we wanted to understand what this was about. And so upon further digging, we unearthed this kind of superfan group of folks who were just passionate about their hobbies and interests, but more passionate about sharing these interests on Google+. And so we went ahead and created this campaign that highlighted and showcased so many of these talented folks. And for instance, this woman was Sui O, and she's an architect in Malaysia. She found herself really, really stressed out at her job. So to unwind, she would go on Google+. And so she learned about photography just from collections alone on Google+. And she was able to kind of just teach herself the actual craft of taking photos. She gained such a sizable following, about 60,000 followers, that soon enough, her work inspired people and galvanized them so that they could create these offline connections where she organized these photo walks around her neighborhood. So this idea that she just traversed like this online space into an offline space was really, really meaningful. And so we tended to dig in more and try to understand, what are these people doing on Google+ in a unique way? What's different about it? And then we came up with Randy Taylor. He is a climber, but he doesn't call himself a photographer, as you can see here. He says he's a climber with a camera. And his climbing stories involve several near-death experiences, because he oftentimes just takes pictures at the summit of all these peaks. And people love living vicariously through him, so much so that 40,000 people have followed him, and his collections are continuing to grow. And then finally, this gentleman here is called Nomad Dimitri. He's not only a globetrotter, but he documented his cancer treatments on Google+. And what he said about that was, it is a voyage after all, perhaps scarier than others, but perhaps also with a greater potential for discovery. And I know from the outset that I don't want this to be a solitary journey. And so words that bubble up to the surface here, like journey, discovery, together, those were the words that we needed to leverage to be able to promote the new Google+, to uncover that human, more meaningful side of the product. But had we leaned on that internal tagline that we thought was so brilliant, we would have never come to this conclusion of how people were using Google+ in such a unique way, these enthusiasts and these really, really passionate folks. So what are the takeaways here? It's all about real talk. Listen to the real talk. Why do users hate or love your product? What are the words that they're using to describe it? Think about those words and see how you can incorporate that into your product experience. Dig deeper. So again, with Sui O, had we known that Google+ could galvanize such a huge following of people from online to an offline space, we would have been able to kind of just create all these different micro stories and promotional kind of stories about people meeting, and really thinking about those human connections that our product was able to create. And then finally, keeping it jargon-free. So we oftentimes tend to lean on these words or these phrases that we create. And what oftentimes it does, it clouds our judgment about user motivations. So really trying to stay away from that and then just keeping close to what your users are saying. All right, so this next section is about best practices. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take you through the process through which I drafted best practices across several different types of product areas. But I wanted to kind of give you an example to ground it more concretely about using chatbots in Allo and thinking about what are the language principles that we leaned on to kind of be able to create guidance for our team and then for the entire organization. So what was the process like, first and foremost? So yesterday we talked a lot about critical user journeys. And so what we need to really do first and foremost is to align with your UX researchers to really identify and define what these journeys are. And then once you do that, creating these, what we call bug bashing parties with cross-functional folks. And this tends to be just a heuristic evaluation of sorts to really figure out where in your product experience there may be broken areas and then how you can address and fix those. And then finally, after you're done kind of documenting all of these holes, figuring out what of these principles are, what principles you can adhere to, and how to document and publish them. So for example, what we did for the chat UI, so Google Allo is a messaging platform on Google, and so we needed to figure out a way to incorporate the Google Assistant into the chat experience to provide a more dynamic way for communication for our users. And so we needed to first break down the chat UI into content, personality, and responsiveness. So what do I mean by content? So for the bot experience in the chat UI, there's the script. And this could be you asking the Google Assistant, hey Google, what's the weather like today? The Google Assistant would respond, it's 19 degrees Celsius. So just that exchange alone is a script, and it's text-based, and it's, again, conversation design, and we talked about this a lot. There's also visual components, so anything that isn't text. These could be buttons. These could be kind of just cards that point to points of interest or other things within the conversational UI. And then finally, there's also this emerging space where we have to be honest that people are going to kind of fall down sometimes and kind of bump into certain things. So how can they recover gracefully? So language is also a way to kind of help people recover gracefully and then create new opportunities to solve these problems. And then we talked a lot yesterday about personality. And we talked about the idea of how people react really strongly to personality. And so we were developing a ton of different types of chatbots in Google Allo, and we did a lot of usability testing. One of them was on a reservation bot. So this was a bot that was able to make reservations for a person if they asked him to. So what was funny about this was we really wanted to test the limits of personality. So this bot was kind of kitschy and overly chatty. It was like, hey, how's it going? What you doing? And so the person who was on the other end of the exchange was just super irritated. All they wanted to do was complete their task, which is understandable. So they were like, I don't understand why this bot is trying to like be friends with me. I just want to go to El Jardín at 7 o'clock. And so really understanding how people react to tone and then keeping it neutral enough so that you could appeal to a mass audience was really important. But also, how else could you inject personality into the conversation design? Well, you could look at emojis and stickers. So these are types of artifacts that don't need to be attached to a bot's personality, but they can be infused into the conversation so that it feels a little bit more human and personal. And then finally, there's smart replies. So depending on how someone responds to a chatbot, we can try to figure out how to tailor their language to the suggested replies that we serve up. And then finally, there's responsiveness. So according to conversation maxims and a lot of the talks yesterday, we know that people really expect a lot out of a bot. They expect this human interaction, even if it's a digital assistant, right? So we want to make sure that we can facilitate the conversation so that it moves at a speed to which we are accustomed to. So we created guidelines around responsiveness. That means no dead ends, speed, how quickly is the conversation happening, and what is the message length in each of these exchanges. But we'll talk a little bit about responsiveness and no dead ends. So more concretely, I just wanted to give an example of a principle that we created for these chatbots regarding responsiveness. And what are no dead ends? So to the right-hand side, you will see the Google Assistant in a chat UI, and someone has asked the Google Assistant, what can you do? And then the Google Assistant responds with, a variety of things. So these are cards with news, places nearby, and fun. So the person can select either of those options, or underneath that, they can actually share a card. Underneath that, they could go on Google search and explore more, or they could give feedback to the system. So these are all structured responses that allow the user to keep moving forward through the conversation with a momentum and a pace that doesn't keep them closed. So creating guidelines around this was really important for us. And so what do we do when we create these guidelines? So for the chatbots, for instance, Google Assistant wasn't the only bot that we were working with. We had several teams across Google that were using this type of technology. So we went ahead and shared it with the broader team, and then again to cross-Google teams. And this allowed us to gather feedback to make sure that we, took into account all the different edge cases and considerations, and then refined our principles. And then finally, the technology also does show up in external parties, third-party partners. And so being able to surface a very consistent experience every single time was key to create that high-quality experience for users. So we actually use this process across several product areas at Google. And so I'm going to go through them today. The first one is photo reply. So here you can see someone sharing an image of this adorable child. And then you see these smart reply chips underneath that image. And so this was a really exciting project. I got to work with the engineers who developed this image recognition technology. And I remember the day he showed me the prototype. My engineer partner was just super stoked. He was like, oh, this is the best thing ever. And I'm like, let's see it. And so I shared a picture of a dog. And what came up was some interesting smart reply chips. One of them was cute Bernese mountain dog. And I was like, ooh, people don't really talk like that. So being able to kind of just balance the editorial finesse with these engineering smarts was important. So creating guidelines around that was something that we did to help engineers. And then again, the Google Assistant, we've talked about this quite frequently today. But thinking about the first run experience and all the different types of surfaces that Google Assistant shows up, it was important for us to create language guidelines so that these experiences were consistent whatever platform it showed up on. And then hyperlocalization on Google Allo. So what does this mean? So on Google Allo, we had several markets that we were serving. Some of them were Brazil and India and Mexico. And so what I wanted to figure out was, can we make more tailored language experiences for these user sets? And would it make a difference in their engagement? So I went to Rio de Janeiro, and I interviewed millennials, and I just wanted to get an understanding of what types of conversations happened within the chat UI, and what kind of parlance and tone was specific to that particular beach region. And what I was able to understand was that there were certain things that we localized that did not at all reflect the natural conversation and parlance and argot of that particular subculture. So really understanding what in the Allo experience could we hyper-localize and tailor that content, and then really figuring out how could we scale that. And so we used a model with these guidelines for the Brazilian market to extend to Mexico and India and Indonesia. And then finally, we've got AR best practices. So again, another emerging space, but being able to collaborate with illustrators and designers and researchers and engineers to really give our partners and our developers guidance on language across these AR experiences, especially because it's so new, was super important for us. And it's also important to note that these are always evolving and changing, and as you create these best practices, really understanding how to be flexible. When you test and you see that there are new insights that might change some of the guidelines that you've already created, then being able to be flexible about those is a really key thing as well when you're developing best practices. So what are the takeaways here? Leverage past learnings use your resources, talk to your cross-functional partners, and really understand what people have already uncovered. And then collaborate and partner with all product folks, no matter if they're eng or product or design. And then finally, you've built these guidelines, so champion and enforce them to steward that consistency. All right, so the next example is from ARCore. And ARCore is Google's platform for building augmented reality experiences. So this was a project that I was working on when I wasn't quite on the team yet. I was working on a kind of what we call 20% of freelance part-time basis on this project because they did not have a writer, as is the case with many teams on Google. And so we wanted to try to understand how to create or how to find the story of ARCore. And so the very first project was the dev site, and this was the draft that I was handed. You can just take a quick read. It's a little bit dry, it's a little bit boring, it's a little bit blah. And so it was really important for me to understand, especially in the space where the players were getting increasingly crowded, where did Google fit? And so Adrian talked about this a lot, about really trying to find what it is that is unique about your product experience. And so how could we do that for something as clinical and technical as an AR platform? And so oftentimes what I do is I take critical user journeys of a product, and then I try to map them onto this narrative arc. And for several of the products that I work on, this tends to be a really, really great exercise to help me understand all of these critical points. But I found that for ARCore, that didn't quite work. So what did I do? I really dug in and talked to all of my stakeholders. And again, like another theme here that keeps on popping up is partnership. So I wanted to figure out what is it that we need to communicate at the acquisitional level to help developers understand what ARCore was all about. And so this is a list of adjectives or attributes that the team came up with. And so some of them are aspirational and action-oriented, and they wanted a developer first and not a product first tone. And also thinking about scale and being open and looking at the future. And so I took these messaging requirements and, pretty simple thing, and went ahead and created an after version. And so you can take a quick read here. There's a few differences. So for the before, welcome is quite product-focused, not user-focused. Build the future speaks to possibility and an open-endedness. And then you can compare build apps versus shape experiences, again, a more aspirational tone. Deploy versus transform, really thinking about influence. Digital objects and content versus digital and physical worlds, kind of thinking about more how the technology relates to the humanness and how we're going to use the technology. And then again, the future of work and play, hinting at this idea of possibility. And then after that, we kind of overlaid this text on top of this fantastical and whimsy visual treatment with animated characters placed in real-life environments. And so you can see just a number of scenarios there that we're trying to just paint the story of trying to make sure that this clinical and dry technology kind of breathing life into the spirit of how it can be more human and connect us. So what are the takeaways here? Find the story. Let your user journeys guide you. And then also lean on your stakeholders to really think about how you want to position your product. Highlight your value prop, what sets your product apart. And then finally, measure and iterate. So you'll likely not get it right the first time, but there's always opportunities to improve. If you fell asleep at all during this talk, this is the one slide that you should pay attention to, because it's got all the answers. So talk to your users. Use a combination of qual and quant research to do that. Partner all the time. I can't emphasize that enough. Share your insights and learnings with stakeholders, and then align with them. And then finally, adopt a growth culture. We talked about this a lot during the entire conference, but keeping on testing and iterating and really trying to improve every single opportunity that you have. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yvonne. I'm trying to get you actually have a ton of questions.
Awesome.
And they keep coming, so it's really cool to have a UX writer to actually ask these questions of.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. So just give me a second to make sure that I have these loaded. That, of course, is last time. Come on. Okay. I just want you to look.
Oh, dang.
Yeah. Holy cow. Like, okay, sorry. So I'm going to do my best to try to pull some of these together. Okay, so one of the very first ones that became probably the most popular is how can you've made this really nicely crafted language. How can you make sure that it stays nicely crafted when it goes into other languages? How do you guys go about that?
So we actually have really amazing folks called transcreation specialists.
Okay.
And so it's different from localization because for localization, it's kind of like this one-to-one translation. But we actually have human beings, like actual writers in specific markets who make sure that they steward that consistency. And Google Assistant is actually a great example. We've got them in so many different countries, and some are creative writers who really understand kind of, the pop culture and different references, and then we kind of compare across the entire experience, like how are these nuances and how are these good cultural references being kind of received. And so we've got those folks to kind of steward that consistency.
So what else? So the other question that there's a few of them around just consistency generally.
Yeah.
How do you maintain that consistency across products?
Really good question.
Yeah.
So you've kind of got to be your own cop, is what I found. So I was generally naive first getting into UX writing, thinking like, these are my strings and they're fantastic and they're going to stay that way. But no, you have to keep on like checking the product versions as each version kind of comes out, and then you see all of these kind of discrepancies, and then you file bugs, and then you talk to engineers and you're like, why is that still coming up wrong? And so like really kind of, again, it's about the partnership and really thinking about how you can keep those lines of communication open and really emphasize the importance of maintaining that consistency.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you think really happened with Google Glass? I'm kidding.
I'm kidding.
Know.
I defer to Adrian.
Okay. Okay, so let's see. So there's a whole bunch around organization. Actually, I'm going to step back for a second before we go to organization.
Okay.
There's actually a number of questions from the audience about being a designer or a researcher. How do you make an inroad into this? Like where do you start if you're a beginner into actually being to do more with UX writing?
I see.
How do you make that transition or?
Wait, do you actually need partnerships, or do you actually being a UX writer?
I'm going to say it's a yes and. Like, it's both partnerships, I imagine, and also just like if you're interested in doing more of your practice.
Well, so the one thing I found that really, really created much more opportunity for impact was partnering with research, first and foremost, because people were like, oh, just fix the string, and then nobody would care about the string. But when I partnered with research, and then I really understood how users reacted to these different variations, like for the duo example, for instance, then people started to notice that, oh, it's making a difference in actual metrics. And so creating a lot of those opportunities to kind of promote where we've had those different wins was important. And then with designers, I've always really fought really hard to get in early and often, and really create those opportunities, even at the kickoff level, to understand even what the vision is, because a lot of times writers get brought in at the very end, and we are asked to just fix strings without having the context of these wonderful conversations that people have about the vision and kind of the goal of the project. So really elbowing your way in to the beginning of this product process.
So I'm actually just reflecting, I'm guilty of bringing writers in later. Because I'm like, I fancy myself good with language.
Totally, yeah.
But not when a real writer does it, I'm super functional. I'm like, click, not click here, but like, learn more. And this is what this thing does. But let's see, so I'm definitely guilty of that. I'm curious, so let's go to the organization question. So let's say that you don't have a UX writer, but you want one.
Yeah.
How do you go about making the case for bringing a UX writer into your team?
See, that's a really good question, because it's definitely a struggle, and a lot of times the reason I do these talks is that so for teams that don't have a UX writer to be armed with some of these tools so that they could do it themselves, because there are so many teams who don't have the budget for a UX writer. Right. But for me, for instance, I was always in a situation where the ratio for writer to designer was like 1 to 20. And so being able to say, well, I can't really scale high quality, wonderful content if there's only one of me and 20 designers that I'm working with. And then people finding like these holes in the product, and then researchers saying like, oh, the user doesn't know what this means. We have to fix it. But then that happening like 30 times and having myself as the only person to be able to kind of fix those issues, that was something that helped leadership understand like, oh, we've got to hire more writers. And so there are so many times in my Google career where I was the one writer for like 10 different apps. And so the fact that it didn't scale, and like the fact that we weren't able to kind of help so much of our products and have to deprioritize, the product tends to suffer, the users suffer, and then the leadership then tends to see that.
Okay.
And it sadly is usually post haste that way, instead of like making the case and then getting what you want. So
yeah, so it's like making the case through experience, sometimes bitter experience.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so actually, we're going to switch a little bit. What is your take on that kind of being, I love it, it said being cheeky, being a little bit cheeky with your language versus being more kind of staid or kind of neutral?
Okay, so is this just for in the context of bots or just in general?
I would say, I'm going to guess it's just in general,
so,
but maybe both, yeah.
Well, the general Google UX writing kind of standard is to be very neutral and universal in tone. For Google Allo, we were given a charter by Sundar to be a little bit more cheeky and just infuse it with a lot more personality. And so then I was super excited to be able to do this. And a lot of my UX writing counterparts were really pissed off because they were like, this is crazy. This is like against the rules. Right. But I found that like being hamstrung by a lot of the rules that we set just for the sake of having rules was just really not lending itself to the creativity that we could definitely like kind of enforce to be able to engage more users. And so like we did see that for hyperlocalization. When I was interviewing these like millennials in Brazil and I showed them versions in their actual dialect, you could just see them light up and they were like, I'd use this app instead of this app. Because I showed them like our localized version that was kind of like automatically translated. And then our hyper-localized version where it was like very thoughtful about the different types of cultural nuances that we kind of popped into the app. Those were kind of these moments where people understood like the power of being like a little bit more kind of leaning towards a more casual and informal language.
Right. Okay. And it's interesting because some of that, like that translation into culture, to different cultures, like humor doesn't always translate, right? I'm sure this doesn't always translate. Let's see too. Give me a second. There's so much in here. Oh well. Sorry. Oh, there's a bunch around this one. There's a whole bunch. It's kind of in that, what's the difference between a UX writer versus a copywriter versus a marketing writer? Yeah.
So a UX writer is in product. So everything within a product experience. A copywriter is kind of at the promotional part of the funnel. So it's not actually in product, but it's like the landing pages and the splash pages that introduce the product. It's kind of like that handshake. And then a UX writer is like in there already having the conversation with the person. And so at different points of the customer journey, then the language then has to therefore change. Like for instance, if I meet you, hi Sarah, my name is Yvonne. Like
hi,
this
Yvonne.
is the acquisitional phase.
Yeah.
But then you and I go on like 5 different like coffee dates or whatever.
Right.
But then every single time if I say, hi Sarah,
hi.
my name is Yvonne. So it's like really, it's like the wrong kind of copy at the wrong time, right? So copywriters are really great at that acquisitional phase.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay, cool. All right, there was one I just skipped by. Oh. At first I was deciding whether, this one kind of irritated me, but then I think there's actually a bunch of interesting stuff in here.
Oh no.
What's better, my account or your account? So I started thinking about first person versus.
Yes, okay, so a Google standard is to always use second person because
which is for the language.
Your account. Okay. Yes, because it feels more inclusive. My account is like more. It's actually so there's a number of things. So on Google Drive, we had like folders on the left-hand side that said my drive, and then some promotional copy that said your Google Drive. So there was like all of this conflict about like these personal pronouns and all this stuff. So then we decided, okay, you is the universal kind of descriptor. We're going to use that across the entire experience. But that was a brand call, like a brand identity call. So for the purposes of a UX writer, they just really need to understand like what it is that the product is prioritizing in terms of like how you speak to a customer, and then just being consistent about it.
Okay.
So there's not one that's better than the other. It's just that if you do have a mix of all of these types of
Right.
pronouns, then you start to create this like sloppiness and distrust with the
Right.
user.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so my last question for you is, what UX writing are you most proud of?
I have to say the hyperlocalization, just because it was really going to these like really remote regions and talking to these users who I would have never had the opportunity to understand and learn about, and uncovering different ways they were using our product. And we're like, wow, that's crazy. I didn't ever imagine someone to do that. And then really kind of taking their language, infusing it in our app, and then feeling like when they did have this in their hands that it was their own app. Like being able to have that experience and like kind of being the bridge to that was really a really proud moment. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you very much,
Thank you
Yvonne.
very much.
I have it right here. I have a gift for you.
Awesome. Thank
Give her a
you.
round of applause.